I hope everybody can see a picture of me completely buried in a hedgerow. I've got some nods and some thumbs up, so fantastic. I will get going then. So hello all, I am Megan Gimber, and I work for a conservation charity called People's Trust for Endangered Species, where I'm the key habitats officer. My main focus is hedgerows, and it's fair to say I am a bit hedge obsessed. While I'm aware that hedgerows aren't in fact an endangered species, it's a habitat that fits really well with the work that we do as a charity, as we focus on a number of species such as dormice and hedgehogs that really do depend on hedgerow network. So the first half of this talk will be a whistle-stop tour of hedges, about their value to wildlife, their value to landowners, a bit about their history, their health, and something about their management. Then after a quick break, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of actually surveying hedges. I will do my best to keep to time, but I am a big hedge enthusiast and I can waffle, so I will try and make sure that I fit everything in. But firstly, some context. Sadly, we're facing the double threat of a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis. The stats shown here are from the recent State of Nature report. Now, while I'm not going to sit here and tell you that hedgerows are going to solve either of these problems, sorry, I may be able to convince you that they're a really good place to start and should certainly be considered as part of our larger arsenal. 70% of the UK is agricultural land. So what we do within this is hugely important for our native wildlife. Obviously, in conservation, we have two very different strategies of protecting wildlife. There's land sparing and there's land sharing. Land sparing, of course, is the idea that we set aside land just for wildlife, where it can thrive and get on with things separated from the actions of us. Land sharing, on the other hand, is the idea that we can manage land in a way that benefits wildlife, as well as benefiting us, in this case, producing food. So interestingly, this is the basis of quite a lot of fierce debate right now between those that favour rewilding and those that favour regenerative agriculture. So do we go for separation or do we go for integration? This is obviously a huge debate, and both have their merits and their drawbacks. But to be perfectly honest with you, I think the situation that we're in necessitates both. And luckily, when it comes to land sharing, hedgerows have the potential to provide us with some easy wins. So as a conservation charity, we're primarily interested in hedgerows for their value to wildlife. And this value is incredible. A great example that I like to use is how vital they are to dormice. Partly because they are hugely charismatic little guys. I mean, look at his face, but also because that's one of the initial drivers for our hedgerow work as a charity. As part of our dormouse conservation work, we reintroduce dormice to areas of the country where they have previously been lost. And before we do this, we need to make sure that these new populations are not isolated and that they have good connectivity to other populations. Now, we've recently lost about 51% of our dormouse population, and we know that they've gone extinct in 17 counties in the last 100 years. So they're in a little bit of trouble. And this connectivity is really important to dormice. It allows them to inhabit fragments of woodland that might otherwise be too small to have a population, just have a viable population on themselves. It can help gene flow between populations in different woodlands. It can allow movement of dormice to recover declining populations. And crucially, it can allow dormice to migrate to suitable new habitat as and when it becomes available. So sadly, the effect of climate change may make this ability to relocate increasingly important for dormice. Being arboreal creatures, it's hedgerows that provide this connectivity for dormice and their safest way of crossing the countryside. And to ensure this newly released population of dormice stood their best chance, we needed to make sure that the hedgerows surrounding our release sites were healthy enough to be used as safe passage. And to do this, we created a hedgerow survey, but I'll get onto that in a little bit. Incidentally, although they're not their primary habitats, hedgerows are also capable of sustaining breeding populations of dormice. But to do this, they need to be healthy hedges. They need to be large and they need to be species rich. Dormice eat a variety of foods, and that changes throughout the year. But this means they need a variety of species growing in their hedge and the hedge at the right stage to be able to fully support them. So that's where we started, but it's fair to say that our commitment to hedges extends far beyond any individual species now. And luckily, it looks like what we do to create a hedge that's suitable for dormice actually has benefits for a whole host of other creatures. So why are hedgerows so great for wildlife? As far as I see it, they provide three main roles. Firstly, they are a physical home, from nesting birds to hibernating hedgehogs, dormice, small mammals, insects, butterflies, you name it. One study counted 2,070 different species in just an 85-metre stretch of hedge in Devon. 2,070. And the author of this study, which is Robert Walton down in Dartmoor, says that he thinks this was a vast underestimate of their true number. He says he was only counting species that you can see with the naked eye, and there were a number of classes that were underrepresented in his survey. And this was just in 85-metre stretch of hedgerow in Devon. So imagine what they have the capability of holding nationwide. Secondly, they are an excellent complementary habitat. So this is one that's not necessarily home, but plays an important role in life. This can be for food, such as leaves, flowers, berries, insects, or for anything that might be hunting small charismatic mammals. Or it may be shelter from predators or from the elements whilst out foraging. 84% of our farmland bird indicator species make use of hedgerows, but for only 52% of these, this is their actual physical home. And thirdly, and just as importantly, they're used as wildlife corridors to help connect populations that would otherwise be isolated and vulnerable, as I've already described for dormice. But this is equally important for things like bats, or for flying insects like butterflies and moths, which may use the warmth and the shelter created by a hedge to allow them to fly. A good example of this, I was once told that bats need 3 different things to thrive in a habitat. They need a roosting site, a safe commute, and they need insects to feed on. And hedgerows and hedgerow trees can provide all 3. But hedges are a man-made and a man-managed habitat, so it may seem odd that they are so rich in wildlife. But while they're not like a natural habitat, actually in structure, they're what we call an ecotone, where 2 or more habitats in this case overlap. And in this case, the structure mimics that of a woodland edge. In this photo, we have one side which is a hedgerow, and the other side which is the edge of a woodland. Can you tell which is which? I'll be honest, I took this photograph and I don't actually think I can remember which side was which. So for hedgerows, we have overlapping elements of woodland, scrub and grassland. And while they certainly don't replicate any of these habitats fully, it does mean hedges are capable of supporting many species that are normally associated with each of them. For some species, it's even greater than the sum of its parts, as some are dependent on more than one or even all 3 of these elements in different parts of their life cycle. In fact, the closer that you look at our native ecology, the more species that you find that thrive in this woodland edge habitat. But why? So an alternative theory to the closed canopy theory is that the ancestral state of this island was one of a mosaic of open areas kept open by large herbivores, wooded areas, glades, and areas with plenty of scrub. And things weren't neatly sectioned off as they are today, which basically meant that there was much more of this woodland edge ecotone about. And this explains why those habitats that mimic this structure, so things like hedgerows, wood pasture, traditional orchards, are all so rich in wildlife. Incidentally, it's this sort of successionary edge habitat created by herbivore movement that rewilded sites often transition to and prize so highly. So rewilding and hedges may have more in common than you would initially have thought. So let's have a look at the structure of a good hedge. A good hedge for wildlife tends to have hedgerow trees, a diverse shrub layer, good height and width, structural complexity, good connectivity, a margin, and base vegetation, so vegetation that extends all the way to the base. I'm going to start with hedgerow trees. So trees are absurdly valuable in hedgerows. In fact, over half of our priority species associated with hedges depend on hedgerow trees. They provide songposts and territory markers for many important bird behaviours. They provide nesting opportunities for birds, for bats, and more. In a year where a hedge has been cut, hedge trees can still provide the flowers and fruits that a recently cut hedge itself can't. And then you've got old hedge trees, especially like the old pollard trees that you find in many ancient hedges and boundary hedges. They provide really valuable dead wood habitat for all of our sort of rare deadwood dependent species. We've got about 2,000 deadwood dependent insects in this country, and of these, at least 320 of them are pollinator species, so very important. Sadly, we've lost a huge number of hedge trees to Dutch elm disease, and we're in the process of losing an awful lot more to ash dieback. And we aren't establishing enough new hedge trees to accommodate these losses. The bottom left of this screen, I hope you can see it, shows a snip from an old Ordnance Survey map. And beside it is the satellite image of what this land is like now. So obviously we've lost a couple of hedges in there, but what's just as striking to me is the loss of the mature hedgerow trees. So they're the ones individually indicated on the Ordnance Survey map and almost gone as seen in the satellite imagery next to it. But in a time when tree planting is all the rage, establishing trees in hedgerows seems like an absolute no-brainer. It doesn't take any land out of production. They form open-grown trees, the benefits of which could be a whole talk in and of itself. They could be managed for timber, for wood fuel, for additional crop production. They could be coppiced or pollarded or left as standards. Small tree species can be used in east-west hedges to reduce any crop shading impact, and large trees can be used in north-south hedges, which have additional benefits of wind protection. They can even be established for free through natural regeneration, which is fantastic. Just tag a suitable young candidate and spare it from the trim. This has the added benefits of preserving the genetic diversity present in your local tree population. So genetic diversity, just like humans have, genetic differences between individuals, so do trees. And actually, genetic diversity is a crucial defense in any tree population against unknown threats of the future. So while one oak may be naturally better in drought conditions, which is pretty useful at the moment, another may be naturally better able to tolerate floods. And a third may have some natural resistance to whatever tree disease may be on the horizon. So certainly preserving this diversity, which is their natural defense against threats, should be a real priority. And regenerating trees in hedgerows can be a real part of that. But of course, trees can also be planted. And call me an optimist, but when I see gaps in hedges, I always think that it's just the perfect opportunity to plant a new hedgerow tree. And all the while, they're providing multiple benefits for us. They're benefiting wildlife, storing carbon, cleaning our air, reducing flood potential, and adding to the beauty of our countryside. There are, of course, instances where trees can have a negative impact, so near marshes or where there's populations of ground nesting birds that, may be sensitive to the extra predation. But so it's always worth checking before launching into large-scale tree planting. But in general, I would say that our hedges could accommodate a whole lot more trees. So I feel I've probably spent too long talking about hedgerow trees. They are a particular passion of mine. So I might have to quickly rattle through some of the other aspects. Next up, we have a diverse shrub layer, which is incredibly important in hedgerow ecology. So hedges with more plant species have higher diversity of invertebrates and birds. So the more species you've got in plants, the more insect species you get, the more bird species you get. And this is partly because each plant will have things that specialise on feeding on it. But also it tends to mean that you've got a better year-round availability of food sources, as they all flower and then they all fruit at slightly different times. Interestingly, the origin story, as well as the location of a hedge, can have a real impact on the species composition and the diversity within the hedge. So some hedges, which we call assart hedges, were left as field boundaries when the fields were originally cut from woodland. These hedges often have fantastic shrub and understory diversity, often with several of the plant species that we commonly use as ancient woodland indicators, still growing at the base. And essentially that's because they once were an ancient woodland before we cut the field into them. And they're still often there as the remnants. Then other hedges on banks, common in the West Country, were planted with wild collected saplings, but they can obviously accrue further species over time. Over half of the Devon hedges, most of which are banked hedges, are thought to be medieval or older. And the banks adds a real interesting element, as the soils within the banks are largely undisturbed, which allows the roots to sort of escape some of the perils of close cultivation and compaction. They're often also paired with a ditch on one side. And this is fantastic. It adds so much more diversity because you've got this sort of damp environment, which is perfect for invertebrates, as well as a whole new array of herbaceous plants. And then, of course, I should probably mention enclosure hedges. So as part of the land enclosures, where common land was hedged and taken for the aristocracy, this went on for about 500 years. But peak enclosure was between 1750 and 1820, and about 200,000 miles of hedging was planted during that time. So to begin with, saplings were collected from nearby woodlands and scrub, but as the demand rose, so did the realization that there was profit to be made. So nurseries soon sprang up, supplying increasing demand for hedging materials. And enclosure hedges, as a result, tend to be single species hedges, mostly hawthorn. And these are the kinds that are sort of slightly species poor hedges that you get in quite a lot of areas in the sort of centre of the country. So mixed species hedges have many advantages over the single species hedgerows, both to wildlife and increasingly also in terms of how robust the hedge is itself to management. So next, the height and the width of a hedge are important indicators of hedge health. So increasing the height and the width increases the diversity and the abundance of wildlife within it. Now this makes sense not only because they provide more hedge volume if they're taller and wider, but it also increases the complexity of the habitats. You've got slightly different features on the outside and the inside in a tall wide hedge than you do a short narrow one. And that complexity offers better shelter for foraging birds and even reduced predation for birds that are nesting in the hedge. Next up, structural complexity. So some species need several hedge features throughout their life cycle. And I think a good example of this is the song thrush. They nest in the sort of dense thicket of the hedge structure. They sing from the hedgerow trees. They eat snails and worms from the hedge base. And again, especially if you've got a good wet ditch at the bottom, before swapping to hedgerow berries later on in the season. So really, there are plenty of species that actually require all of these features of a hedge to be there and in good condition for them to really thrive in that hedgerow setting. Then we've got good connectivity, as I've already mentioned for dormice, a margin at the base. Now this protects the roots of the hedge and the shrubs, but it can also be really herb rich with lots of nice wildflowers. And plenty of birds and small mammals and insects really rely on this strip of land at the base. And then vegetation all the way to the base of a hedge is a very important feature, partly because of how important the base of a hedge is to wildlife. You'd be amazed by how much really depends on that vegetation right down to the bottom of the hedge, but also because it's a really good indicator of how healthy your hedge is. So many hedges, as I'm sure you will have seen, sort of start to thin out at the base, and it can do this for several reasons, through maybe being slightly overgrazed by sheep, sometimes through being trimmed too frequently at the same height. It can lose that vegetation, or if they get too tall, they can start shading the base out themselves. And really, a thinning vegetation at the base is a really good signal that the hedge needs some rejuvenation. So I feel like I may have laboured the point of hedgerow wildlife, but I promise that was just a glimpse. But obviously, some hedges are in better shape than others, and the management that they see has a huge impact on their capacity to sustain wildlife, and even their capacity to act as effective wildlife corridors. This photo was actually taken in Kent, minus Gandalf, and was part of the testing phase of our Hedgerow Survey. And the hedgerows in this area were so poor and fragmented that it was actually difficult to get a section of hedge long enough to survey. So this level of fragmentation obviously makes it impossible for animals such as the dormice to use these hedges for any of their three core uses. So why are we worried? And what's currently threatening hedges? In no particular order, undermanagement is the surprising one that many people don't realise. Hedgerows actually do require management in order to stop them developing into a line of trees. Now, a line of trees doesn't sound like a big bad thing. You know, we love trees, but allowing a hedge to develop into a line of trees, it will then become gappy. It will lose that low shrubby cover that's so valuable to wildlife. And it's also not such a permanent feature in the countryside as a hedgerow itself can be. So it will start to lose trees as they compete with each other. They'll topple, and it's very difficult to bring that back into a healthy hedge condition. The last countryside survey saw a massive 9% increase of hedges that had been lost to this over a decade. And once, as I said, once a hedgerow has become a line of trees, it's actually really difficult to bring it back. So it's quite important to avoid that happening. The next one is over-management. So this is probably what more people are familiar with. So this is when a hedge is cut too often and cut to the same height. So it not only reduces the value of the hedge to wildlife, but it also threatens the structure of the hedge in the long term, and so the future of the hedge, really. So increasingly, stems will be lost, and while first the remaining hedge plants may stretch to fill the space, which always reminds me of this painting, stretching to touch them. You know, as more and more stems get lost, if they're continually cut at the same height year after year after year, this leads to gaps forming in the hedge. And again, if this management continues in that same way, those gaps will extend, and the hedge will eventually fail if nothing changes. Next, we've got ploughing too near to the hedge. This damages the roots of the hedge and any hedgerow trees. sometimes this can kill, you know, the hedge trees directly, but actually what's more common is it can weaken them. So it'll weaken the hedgerow shrubs, it will weaken the hedgerow trees to a point where those can no longer cope with other stresses, especially things like drought. Then we've got direct removal, which is actually less of an issue nowadays than it used to be. It's possibly more of a planning and development issue now. Certainly the whole scale grubbing up of the 1960s and 70s is gone, luckily. And lastly, I think spray drift from herbicides, pesticides and fertilizers. So obviously the herbicides and the pesticides have a direct impact on a hedge biodiversity, but it's actually the fertilizers is a little bit more complex. Again, the last countryside survey said that nutrient enrichment was having a huge effect on the plants that are able to thrive at the base of a hedge. Now, diverse wildflowers don't do well under highly over fertilized soils. They'll lose their fungal associations, which they need to survive. Some are directly incapable of growing in high nutrient soils, but also you get other plants that will really thrive in that condition and just completely outswamp them. So things like nettles, docks and cleavers. And then the last threat, I would say, is tree diseases, which is something that I think individually we can't really do huge amounts about. It needs to be sort of tackled at a larger scale, really, but having an absolutely devastating impact on our countryside. I mean, we saw the impact that Dutch elm disease has had. We're now seeing what ash dieback is doing, and I really hope there aren't many more on the horizon, because at this rate we're losing quite a lot of our hedgerow trees. So as I mentioned, we went through some dark decades of incentivized hedgerow removal after the war. Some estimate we lost up to 50% of our hedges, and a lot of these can still be seen as shadows in the countryside. Incidentally, the image on the screen at the moment comes from a fascinating website that allows you to see old Ordnance Survey maps side by side with satellite images. It's a fantastic website. I've put the link on the screen, but it does come with a warning. It is a hugely addictive website. I cannot get enough of this. I have it on my mobile phone, so whenever I'm out for a walk anywhere new and I see a landscape feature, I think, oh, I wonder what would have been there 120 years ago. This is a fantastic website that can show you that. But sadly, it does show you the extent of the loss of hedges. So I'm glad to say that the outright removal is largely behind us, especially in the agricultural sector. And I now see more hedges being planted than ever, which is fantastic. But it is worth remembering that what we have now shouldn't be considered the baseline. The new hedges that we plant can't directly replace the value of the ones that we've lost. And given the historic loss, it's more important than ever that our remaining hedgerows are healthy. Even though the direct removal is no longer such an issue, we do still risk losing many of our hedges, largely through the way that they're being managed. So the last countryside survey showed that only 48% of the hedges are in good structural condition. And this is worse in purely arable land, where only 10% of managed hedges are in good structural condition and with appropriately managed margins. And in a lot of cases, this is the result of hedgerows no longer being managed according to their life cycle. So I've referred to the last countryside survey a number of times at this point. I hope you are all aware of it, but just in case, I'll give a quick introduction. It was a comprehensive survey of the countryside, paid for by the government, that assessed various aspects of habitat health. They were done every decade, and the results of them have been absolutely fundamental to our understanding of hedgerow health, as well as the health of all sorts of other habitats across the country. They were absolutely invaluable tool to see how hedges change over time, and having one every 10 years was just a fantastic way of giving us a snapshot. But unfortunately, the last one was done in 2007, so we're already overdue the next instalment, and it looks unlikely that this will be funded again. So this is a huge loss in our ongoing understanding of how this habitat's changing over time. But what we can say from the results of the 2007 survey, plus anecdotal evidence, we know that it's now the health of hedges that we need to be worried about. And while it's illegal to remove them without first getting permission, we've got from the 1997 Hedgerow Regulations Act, it's not illegal to manage them in such a way that they do slowly disappear over time. And when we look at the trend in species that depend on hedgerows, it doesn't paint a pretty picture. This is the trend for farmland bird indicator species. And remember that 84% of these depend on hedges. But even if you didn't give two hoots about wildlife, this really isn't great, partly because the additional benefits that we're missing out on. I'm often told that hedgerows have lost their function, as wire fences are now cheaper and easier way to control livestock. But this ignores all of the other practical, on-farm and environmental benefits that hedges bring us. Stock-proof fencing is not their only value. So what have hedgerows ever done for us? Again, I'm going to have to rattle through these quite quickly because I realise I'm rattling on quite a lot. Hedges deliver huge benefits to farmland beyond that of a field boundary, and the more you look, the more you find. So I'm going to start with livestock. I've heard that hedges make a great stock-proof barrier, but in addition to this, they provide really valuable shelter. So livestock without shelter have a higher mortality rate. They require more food. Shelter increases lamb survival rates, which can, reducing the effect of wind chill and hypothermia. The shelter that a hedge provides to a field can extend up to 16 times the height of a hedge. So if your hedge is 1 meter high, it can extend 16 meters into your field, which is quite phenomenal. Next up, shade. In the summer months, heat stress can take a huge toll on our livestock, and you'll often see cows and sheep crowding into the shady areas of a field. Now, heat stress can reduce milk yield in dairy herds. It can affect fertility. It affects growth rates and even immune function. So it's really crucial. Next up, diet diversity. So again, when you put livestock into a field, you'll often see them browsing on hedge plants, even when put onto a field full of fresh pasture. And again, this supplementary browsing on diverse plants from a hedgerow can increase gut microbial diversity. And this is linked to improved immune function, improved feed conversion efficiency, and all sorts. Livestock have even been able to show that they can self-medicate to certain degrees by browsing on common species often found in hedgerows. Next up, we've got biosecurity. So a thick stock-proof hedge can be a barrier to the spread of diseases by reducing animal-to-animal contact. Next up, for crops, what can hedges do in arable land? And again, considering that hedges are in a poorer condition in arable land, it's really important that we highlight all of the benefits that they can bring to our cropped land. So firstly, again, wind damage. Hedges provide a windbreak, which can reduce the damage that high and cold winds do to crops, such as crop lodging or premature flower and fruit shedding. If you get that cold, blasty wind that comes at this time of year and can knock off all the blossom. It can reduce chilling injuries or shoot damage. Next up, it may also help us reduce the amount of pesticides that we use in the long term. So hedges can increase the populations of beneficial insects, such as predatory spiders or parasitic wasps and hoverflies, that can help us control pest species and help prevent their populations getting out of control. They also, of course, support diverse populations of pollinators, obviously essential for our crop pollination. Hedges, they provide forage that can sustain these populations of pollinators throughout the year. So while our crops might only be in flower for a couple of weeks, pollinators need to eat for a larger part of the year than that. And so having things like hedgerows and habitats like margins in place can help support those populations of pollinators. But it's also really important to have uncropped land nearby. So again, hedgerows can provide this, where pollinators can overwinter and sort of fulfill their full life cycle. It's not, pollinators have additional needs other than a floral diversity. Next up, we've got hedgerows can reduce soil erosion, which is another really hot topic right now. So they do it in a number of ways. They can reduce the surface wind speeds, stopping the dry soil just blowing away. But they can also act as a barrier to waterborne runoff, as well as helping to stabilise the soil surface. Next up, they can play an important role in times of flood. Plant roots increase the rate of water infiltration into the soil. And this helps the soil act like a sponge to soak up all the flood water, rather than allowing it just to run off the surface. So tree and hedgerow roots are much deeper than crop roots, and this means that a deeper area of the soil profile can act like this sponge, which can soak up more water and faster, basically preventing and delaying the movement of this excess water downstream. Then there are the ecosystem services, which is a horrible term, but I don't know of a better one. So they help with things like air and water pollution. So as well as capturing and storing carbon. So hedgerow carbon is another big topic. They store carbon above and below ground. So they can have a really important role in reducing the rate of climate change. The NFU have said that hedgerows will have a big role to play in our goal of becoming carbon neutral. As have the Committee for Climate Change and Natural England, who actually are pushing for a 60% increase, which is fantastic. And this isn't just new hedges. It's not, we're not saying 60% more hedges, but it's a combination of that and allowing hedgerows to become a little bit taller, a little bit wider, basically storing more carbon in the long term. And as well as maybe putting in some more hedgerow trees. Many of our hedges could do with a few more trees anyway, so I think that would be a fantastic contribution. Other benefits of hedges, honestly this list goes on and on, so I'm just going to have to pick a few more and then I'll move on. Privacy can be a good one, so hedges can act as a screen and protect privacy. So while this is great for people's houses and their gardens, it's also a real asset on farm. So the privacy that hedges provide can shield some farm assets and buildings from the public sight and hopefully reduce some opportunistic rural crime. And then of course, lastly, I couldn't reel off these lists of benefits without mentioning the sense of place. I mean, can you even imagine our countryside without hedgerows? I can't. It's not a pretty thought, certainly. They are a defining feature of our countryside, and they have a deep and significant cultural and historic importance. They make the countryside more attractive, but they tell the story of our farming traditions over the many centuries, and they add to our regional distinctiveness. Of course, I can't rattle off all of the benefits without mentioning a few of the compromises. Anything that seems too good to be true tends not to be. So hedge cutting can be expensive, that is true. I've got a simple solution for that. Tall hedges can cast shade into fields, and that can affect the ripening of crops. They can hinder the movement of extra large machinery. And of course, they do take up land that could otherwise be cropped and used for production. But while most of these compromises can be managed and mitigated, it is up to every landowner to sort of balance the pros and the cons of hedgerows. As far as I see it, the benefits of hedgerows far outweigh those limited compromises, most of which can be mitigated for to some extent anyway. But all of these benefits depend on healthy hedgerows. So how do we achieve that? And what does it mean? What does a perfect hedgerow look like? Is there a perfect hedgerow structure? So unfortunately, I do not have a definitive answer to that question. But what I can say is the more variation in hedge structure within the network, the more species will be supported. So we need hedges of all different shapes and sizes to really support the wildlife that thrive in them. So we know that a diversity of hedges structures within the network supports more wildlife, and we know that hedges are best managed on a life cycle. So when you take both of these ideas together, it neatly leads us to rotational management of our hedges, managed according to their life cycle. And this benefits us as well as massively benefiting wildlife. So this is what that can look like. This is the hedgerow management cycle, and it's my favourite diagram of all time. What it shows is that hedgerows are dynamic. They're a dynamic living habitat, and so they need dynamic management based on that life cycle. They aren't just green walls, and they can't be treated as such without declining in structure over time. It's not possible to keep a hedge at the same point in its life cycle for too long without seeing structural decline. It needs to keep moving through this life cycle. Now, some decline faster than others. Some decline so slowly that you barely notice the change until it's too late. So this diagram might look a little bit complicated at first sight, but what I love about it is that it shows that no matter what stage your hedge is in, there is a way of bringing it back to being in healthy condition. At the centre here, I don't know if you can see on the screen, in the centre, these are the dense and the well-managed hedges. The management here includes rotational cutting, incremental size increase, so allowing them to get slightly bigger and slightly wider every time you cut. But of course, crucially, it always includes some form of rejuvenation. So this is the traditional hedge laying or hedge coppicing. And this really thickens it up from the base. Depending on how you manage your hedge in the meantime, you may only need to rejuvenate every 40 or so years, but it is an absolutely fundamental part of the hedgerow life cycle. And it's actually this rejuvenation stage that basically renders a hedge immortal. If you follow this cycle and keep laying it, letting it grow, laying it, letting it grow, they can actually live for hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of years. So the problems in hedge management are represented on the two flanks of this image. On the left, you have hedges that have become overstood. So as I mentioned before, they do actually require some management, and without it, they race upwards, lose stems, topple over, become gappy line of trees, which is not great. On the right-hand side of this image is the process of over trimming. And again, this is trying to keep the hedge in the same box shape for too long. Again, it loses the structure at the base. It develops what we call a hard knuckle at the trim line, which is sort of as you get the sort of scar tissue where it's trimmed to the same height too often. It loses stems and it becomes gappy. I would say these are far more of a priority to fix, as not only are they disappearing slowly in front of us, but in the meantime, they're not even fulfilling any of their benefits, not to wildlife, not to the climate, and not to us as landowners. And these over-trimmed hedges, they're also just much worse for wildlife. I don't even know how to describe, how much worse they are. Trimming every year significantly reduces the number of flowers and the fruits that wildlife can enjoy. Most of our native berry-bearing species only actually flower on second-year wood. 1 second, I'll just plug this in. And that means if you chop your hedge every single year, you're chopping off an awful lot of the wood that would be flowering and then berrying. The hedge on the left here it's completely covered in berries. Earlier in the year, it would have been equally covered in blossom. It's actually in a non-intervention stage at the moment, which is why it's looking so covered in berries. And the one on the right was taken 5 minutes later, and it's another hawthorn hedge, but this hedge is trimmed every single year. And you can see it's completely devoid of berries in comparison. So if this seems like a lot to take in, you're in luck. We've created some tools to help on a hedge by hedge basis. So back to our dormouse reintroductions, we wanted to create a survey that health checked these hedges, giving instant feedback to the user. And as we did this, we were able to build in some bespoke management advice for each hedge that was surveyed. And this is what we'll be going into a little bit more after the break. So I think the future looks good for hedgerows. They've been with us since the Bronze Ages, and they have weathered some pretty turbulent times. Last century wasn't the first time, nor will it be the last, that politics has had an impact on our hedges. From land enclosures to riots and uprisings, the history of hedges is almost as fascinating as their wildlife. I say almost, not quite, but almost as fascinating. But now we're recognising the plethora of benefits that they bring us on so many levels. There's a growing interest in making sure that they have a healthy future. And that's lucky, because we are the ones that are writing the next chapter in their history. So I thought I'd pause here to give us a little bit of time to have a comfort break, grab a cup of tea or a glass of water. If I stop sharing, there we go. I'm happy to take questions now, or perhaps after the break, whichever you'd prefer. But after the break, we'll be looking more at the Hedgerow Survey and a little bit about the process of Hedgerow surveying.
Thank you very much, Megan. We did have one question in the chat. So Kevin said, a farming friend of mine has said that whilst they cut their hedges every 2 years at the present, the government environment funding scheme will require hedges to be cut every 3 years. And the farmer's concerned that this make the hedge very leggy and gappy. Neil did reply that he's been cutting on rotation with nothing getting cut more than 3 years and his hedge is looking really good. But what are your thoughts?
As far as I know, there's no scientific evidence or evidence at all that cutting on a 3-year rotation makes them leggy. The reason it's changed from the 2-year to the 3-year is because if you cut every other year, which is the sort of the 2-year rotation, but if you cut in September, you've had the flowers, so you've had the benefit of the blossom on the 2nd year wood, but if it then gets cut in September, it cuts off all the berries. So there's something like a 3.5 times more berries on a hedge that's cut every 3 years as to a hedge that's cut annually. But if you cut them in September, then it cuts them all off anyway. And in some areas, for practical reasons, you know, the soil can be too wet to cut later in the season, or in January or February, which is when we prefer hedges to be cut. But again, yeah, so the 2-year to 3-year was basically because if they get cut in September, it means the berries still aren't there for the wildlife to fatten up on for winter. But yeah, as far as evidence about them getting leggy, I don't think there is actually any evidence to show that that does happen. I think on really long non-intervention, so if you extend that too far, it will start to shade out the bottom and they will start to get gappy. But I think a 3-year rotation hasn't really shown those effects.
Thank you. Okay, shall we say back at 5 to then, so everyone have a quick break? And pop your questions in the chat if you do have any, so Megan can pick them up in a minute.
Marvellous, is my summary. But essentially, although legislation made it illegal to remove hedgerows last century, 1997, without the relevant permissions, we're still at risk of losing many across the country through the way they're being managed. And there's no legislation to stop the degradation by repeated flailing or the progression to a line of trees through lack of management. And this is why surveying hedgerow health is so important. So all of that was really a warm-up for me to tell you about the hedge survey we've created. When we did our hedge surveys for our dormouse release sites, we found that the data was really useful in decision making. But when the data had served its use for us, we wanted somewhere where we could put it that it could contribute to further research. And we found that there wasn't really anywhere to put it. DEFRA had funded a web-based database, but the funding on that had long since dried up and it was in need of a little bit of updating. So we took this project on ourselves to build a new one. After all, it would be really useful for many of our hedge species related projects. And while we were at it, we thought that the DEFRA survey, which was until this point sort of standard methodology for surveying hedges, could do with a bit of updating itself. We didn't see the need to reinvent the wheel for the survey. I mean, the DEFRA method was well researched, it's comprehensive, so it was a really good starting point. But knowledge, research, and what was possible on a website has moved on since then. So we were able to add some extra features. Firstly, we could give direct feedback about the health of each hedge that you survey. And secondly, we could give out management options based on the survey results. So the aim of the survey is to provide comprehensive and useful condition feedback to the user with tailored management plan for each and every hedge surveyed. We also want to get a national view of hedgerow condition. And again, this is so important for us to be able to guide our messaging, to be able to guide our future conservation work. And lastly, to continue to raise awareness for how amazing hedges are. So with that in mind, the survey, the Great British Hedgerow Survey, has a broad set of target audiences. So firstly, farmers and landowners, anyone surveying a hedge will automatically get management advice, which we think is a real advantage of this survey methodology. Next up, wildlife groups. So there are plenty of groups up and down the country already doing fantastic work surveying hedges. And what we wanted to do was provide something that's going to be useful to wildlife groups that are doing this. So this website can provide a simple and meaningful format. It allows direct data input, so you don't have to type them back up if you don't want to. Although, I'll be honest, I still do it on paper and then type it up later because I think I'm just a bit old school. It provides immediate feedback on the health, but allows you to have a platform to actually collate all of this survey data. And again, it makes your data work harder. So as well as being able to use your hedgerow surveys and what you've learned for your local outcomes, this data then becomes available for us on a national level, for us to be able to have a look at what's going on nationally and understand what conservation is needed. And last user group is individuals. There's absolutely nothing to stop individuals going out there and doing it. I think you learn a huge amount about what's around you by stopping to look at it a bit closer. And hedgerows and hedgerow surveying is no different. So as I said, we didn't need to reinvent the wheel from the survey. I don't know if any of you actually did the different survey methodology. If you have, then you'll recognize the top left picture. If you didn't, then just focus on the bottom right one. We've streamlined the DEFRA one down from 7 pages of form to 2, to make it a lot easier to do these assessments. We found that actually on the original form, only a handful of the questions actually contributed to the condition assessment anyway. So we thought, whilst we were making it more streamlined, we were also going to make more use of the data that was inputted, only collect the data that was absolutely relevant for the hedgerow condition, and make that data work harder. So this is what the form looks like now. This will have been sent to you earlier today, but it doesn't matter if you're not familiar with it yet. It's on the screen, so I don't need to show it to you in paper. But really, it's done in a couple of sections. The hedgerow survey. So at the top in pink, there's just a little bit of admin data. Then in the green box in the middle, that is information you collect about the whole of the hedgerow from node to node. So it's things like the length of the hedge, the number of openings, the number of gaps, and information that you're going to be collecting on the whole of the hedgerow. Then the box below it in blue is what we do in a 30-meter survey section. So the idea is to look at your big long hedge to find out a 30-meter section that is representative, so that represents the whole of that survey, the whole of that hedge, sorry, and to answer some questions about that. And these are questions such as the average height, the average width, whether there's a bank, whether there's a wall, having a look at the base of the hedge. As I said, the base of the hedge tells us an awful lot about the way it's being managed and whether it needs rejuvenation. And the second page, which is the half on the right here, this is actually looking at the number of woody species. So that whole page there is basically a list of species, which you tick if they're present. And then for the top 5 most abundant species in your 30-meter sample, we ask you to just sort of estimate the percentage coverage of those of your top 5, the top 5 species of your hedge. And this here is a key piece of the puzzle. Again, this was on the notes that got sent out earlier. So these are the various structures of a hedge, and it gives you, this key helps sort of ascribing each hedge a hedgerow structure. And this is one of the ways that we work out at which stage of the life cycle each hedge is in. So it's certainly worth familiarising yourself with this key. If you're anything like me, this key and how it fits into the hedgerow management cycle, which is, I don't know if you can see it here, which is this one that I showed you earlier, will revolutionise the way that you look at hedges. Once you see how they fit into this life cycle and the little sort of telltale signs that hedges give you that they need to move on to that next stage, you won't be able to see hedges in a new way. So this here was actually the brainchild of Nigel Adams of HedgeLink and the National Hedge Laying Society. It's provided a remarkable way of understanding how hedgerows need to be managed at different points in their life cycle. And this is an example of the feedback. It's a bit difficult to see on the screen here, but in the top you get a score for your hedge. Now 46 is actually quite a good score. There is no perfect hedge, so there's no getting 65 out of 65. And then below it, it gives some broad brush general advice. And then below that, you've got 3 other separate scores based on the structure, the biodiversity and the connectivity, as well as a blow-for-blow account of every place that the hedge lost points and what you can do about it. And these 3 scores generally reflect the 3 main wildlife functions of a hedge that we discussed earlier. So I think, as we've all sort of got the survey forms, and I don't really want to go through it point by point because it might not be too interesting, but what I might do is show you how each of these scores are tallied, just to show you sort of how we're using this data and how it goes into all of these scores. So hedgerow connectivity, this is one of the 3 scores. So we measure both the connectedness within a hedge and also the connectedness of the hedge within the landscape. So within a hedge, we measure hedgerow gaps. Now, gappiness in a hedge is often a result of hedgerow management, and it's another one of those good indicators that actually tells you that you need a change of management if you've got gaps. So we look at sort of the percentage gaps of a hedge, as well as the number of gaps more than 5 meters. We also look at the connections. So we look at how well how well this hedge connects up the landscape. So how many other hedges does your hedge connect to? And as you can see, this top circle, if we're looking at the hedge that's marked in orange, it's got 3 other hedges connecting to it at the top, and down at the bottom it connects to a woodland, which counts as 2. So the next score is hedge wildlife, and a number of aspects go into this. So the number of woody species. So again, as I mentioned before, the more plant species found in a hedge, the greater number of other species that that hedge can support. So the number of woody species is counted. Then the relative abundance. So we look at, as well as asking you to tick which species are present, we ask you to estimate the percentage abundance of the top 5 species in that hedge. And this is a measure of how, it's to make sure that a hedge isn't 95% hawthorn, but with 1% rose or hazel or elder, but to see whether it's got a good spread. Then we look at the food list. So whilst all plants are part of the food chain and all of them are useful to wildlife in some way or other, there are some plants that stand out as providing abundant food for a huge range of species. So we've got a list of those, and these will automatically get picked out of the data that you put in to see how well that hedgerow is providing food for wildlife. Then we've got hedgerow trees. So we ask you to look at both mature trees and young trees. So that's differentiated by the size. Basically, we don't actually want you climbing into the hedges and measuring them, because it turns out it's quite difficult to measure the girth of a tree in a hedgerow. In most hedgerows, you can get pretty scratched up if you're trying to clamber into the centre, but it's whether they're above or below 20 centimetres diameter at breast height. And then we look at the flora. So again, we don't record individual species of the herbaceous vegetation at the base of a hedge, as this information is quite seasonally dependent. It's location dependent, and it would be really difficult to ascertain a sort of hedge condition from. But what we do instead is we have a measure of how available the hedge base is to accommodate a diverse flora. So any area that has had high nutrient enrichment, as I mentioned earlier, is less likely to support diverse wildflowers. For a number of reasons. So instead of actually counting the number of flowers that are at the hedge base, we're looking at things like nettles, docks and cleavers and their abundance at the base of our hedge, because they can be a bit of a warning sign to us that the hedge has been too enriched. It's got too many nutrients in. So those 3 species, there's nothing wrong with nettles, there's nothing wrong with cleavers, but we use them as a proxy measurement for nutrient enrichment. And the last score that's calculated is the hedge structure score. And again, we look at the height and the width for the reasons I mentioned earlier. We look at the base canopy, which is how leggy the hedge is getting. And again, you can lose vegetation at the base of a hedge for a number of reasons. It can be that it's being trimmed too much at the same height, or that it hasn't been trimmed in a long time and it's overshaded itself, or that it's just been grazed. Sheep do quite a good job of grazing out the base of a hedge. But whenever you get a high base canopy, it really is a handy sign that the hedge needs some sort of rejuvenation, because as I said earlier, that vegetation at the base is absolutely crucial for wildlife. And lastly, we look at the shape and the structure of a hedge. So as I showed you in the key earlier, so you just choose which one your hedge most looks like. We've got descriptions of those in the key, and we've also got some nice handy photo galleries to show you good examples of those. And the last thing we look to for the hedge structure score is signs of structural damage. So this is things like whether there's a hard knuckle of scar tissue at the trim line, things like that. Oh yeah, and a bit about the margin. Okay, so that's the theory, but what about in practice? Some top tips for hedgerow surveying. Number one, read the guidance notes before you go out. It's only a couple of pages long, but I'd also suggest taking them with you, because while the guidance notes make sense when you're sitting in your sitting room, sometimes there are things that you might not have considered, or you know, it's less clear when you're actually out there. So I'd certainly recommend taking them out. Next up, I would say measure your paces so that you know what 30 meters is like without having to use a tape measure each time, because using a tape measure can get a bit tedious. So if you know how long your pace is, it's going to be way easier to measure out 30 meters to do your sample. Next up, take a stick. So I have a telescopic stick, which I think originally was a paint roller, telescopic paint roller, that I've marked on with permanent marker every 10 centimeters. It's a really good way of measuring the height, but actually there's almost no way of measuring the width of a hedge without a stick. Trust me, I've tried and it's not fun. You definitely need a stick to poke through the hedge to actually work out how wide a hedgerow is. Next, I would say a second pair of eyes is really helpful. Firstly, to spot things that you might have missed or they might have missed, but also you can take a step back whilst one's holding the measuring stick. You can get a better perspective for things like hedgerow height. Equally, you know, when assessing the percentage coverage of the top 5 species, I find it's way easier if I've got someone else there. We can sort of generally discuss what we think's the top 5 and what percentage they all are, and you get a much more accurate thing at the end of it. It's also an awful lot more fun to go surveying with another person rather than on your own. So I definitely recommend having a second person with you. Next up, ID skills. So we actually don't ask you to look at that many species, and most of the species on this list are quite common tree species. But I would say sometimes you come across something and you're just like, I have no idea what that is. So sometimes taking out a book or just a guide to basic tree species, I think, is quite useful. And lastly, I'd say a nice day. I have surveyed in the rain before, and it's still quite fun, to be honest, but especially if you've got a good coat. But actually it is a lot nicer doing it on a nice sunny day. So I hope this is going to play. I have a video which the idea is just to give you a flavour of what surveying a hedge is like. Let me see. If I start playing this, could you give me a thumbs up or something if you can hear the sound? Is that working? Yes, brilliant. Okay, good. So I hope that gave a bit of a flavour of what it's actually like to do a hedgerow survey. I was obviously doing it on my own then, but it is more fun to do it with other people. So to further help, there are some supporting materials on the website. Like I mentioned, these are on here. These are photo galleries, and these show the hedges at all the different stages that are shown on that hedge stage illustrations that I was showing you earlier. And it's 20 or so photos of each hedgerow stage, things like what to look out for and how to recognize the different stages of the life cycle, how to tell an H1 hedge from an H7. But I'm very proud of this one. This is a gallery called Reading Hedgerows, and it's really how to read particular features of a hedge and how to understand past management, how that's worked on it. How to read those little indicators that a hedge is showing us, telling us that it's time for a new sort of change in management. So we hope that sort of sharing this knowledge and sort of spreading awareness and providing management advice, we can see a lot more rejuvenated hedges in the future. So what do we want to see? Ultimately, I want to see hedgerows bigger, better and more joined up. I want them fulfilling their potential, economically, ecologically and environmentally. I want them managed on a life cycle with fewer gaps and more trees. Whole books can and have been written about the value of wildlife, the value of hedges to wildlife. How they feed, how they travel, how they live in hedgerows, and they would barely scratch the surface of hedgerows' true value. So any picture I have attempted to paint will certainly not have done justice to the importance of this network, especially at a time where we're seeing such worrying declines in our wildlife. That was actually supposed to be the last slide of my talk, but I've actually got some interesting and exciting news on the horizon. Hot off the press is we've got a second survey coming out aimed specifically at farmers and landowners. So this one's called Healthy Hedgerows, and it's actually a rapid assessment tool. So it's like the Great British Hedgerow Survey, but it's streamlined down to just 6 questions. And the difference here is the Great British Hedgerow Survey, which is the full survey I've been talking about all today, provides us with an awful lot more information and data for us to get a better picture about hedgerow health. But actually, if a hedge survey takes 20 minutes to half an hour each, it's not always feasible for a farmer to do their entire farm in one go. So this hopefully will streamline that specifically for farmers and for land managers that want to get that management advice without necessarily counting all the species in a hedge. So hopefully it will provide some good information. That's just a bit of stats about why we've done that. Okay, so I am happy to take some questions about hedgerows in general or hedgerow surveying. I know I haven't gone through the whole process question by question, which I would have done if we had gone through this in person, but I thought I might not be able to keep your attention if I was doing that on a Zoom call. So if you've had a read through the survey notes and have any questions, now would be your time to ask.
There were a few questions in the chat already.
Oh,
so the first one is, if a hedge gets too big or tall after trimming, trimming after 3 years, is it possible to just give it one big cut, say 2 foot, without harming the hedge? And would this act as regeneration without having to layer or replant?
It depends on the hedge, I'm afraid. Sometimes yes. So if it's not showing any structural decline at the base, again, the base is the key to a hedge. Any hedgerow I look at the base first. If you've still got really thick, good vegetation at the base, then a hedge can be reshaped in that way. So things like circular saws are quite good for doing that, and you can get circular saw attachments as you would a flail attachment. But not all hedges will cope with that. So some I can't give a nice answer to this, I'm afraid. Some will be fine if they've got a good base already. Others might not. So what can happen if you do that and you've got a leggy structure is it will look like a pollard, and it will sprout out lots of new growth just from the top. So we want to avoid that because we want density all the way down to the base. So yeah, sometimes it's possible if there's already good base vegetation, but not always.
Super, thank you. And then 2 other questions that actually tie in quite nicely. So Kevin's asked about, so as we don't have right to roam on most land, and you obviously need landowner permission to access a lot of hedges, and farmers have been managing their hedges all their working lives, what qualifications or experience are a surveyor going to need to be able to do this, and kind of what reassurance can they give to a farmer? And Sarah, following on from that, has asked if you've got any leaflets that we could give to farmers or landowners to explain why they might want to give permission to do a survey.
Very good questions. So you don't need any qualifications to do this. If you are confident in IDing hedge species, that's probably the most difficult part of the survey. Yes, you definitely do need landowner permission. Absolutely. What we've found so far is we've got a number of projects that are doing this across the country who are actually working alongside the landowners. So it will be a whole project set up. They'll get all the landowner permission in advance, and then they'll go out and do the surveying, and in return they will give the survey results to the landowner, which basically sort of the landowner can then, if they want to, have a look at this and use it to sort of create their sort of future hedge management plans. So it definitely needs to be done alongside the landowners and the farmers. And actually, I think it's definitely for the benefit anyway. I mean, the more we can get conservation and wildlife groups and landowners and farming groups working together, the better, because we're all at the end of the day working to common goals. And I think working together is definitely an approach that I would advise. So there was a second part of that question that I've ignored, wasn't it? What was the second part of that question?
No, it was just if you've already got any leaflets or materials that.
Yes, I do have a leaflet. It's not in print at the moment, but I've got a leaflet that's available online. I actually might do another print run this year. It's called Healthy Hedgerows on Your Land. And it basically it spells out the hedgerow life cycle. It has that illustration about all of the reasons why, as a landowner, you'd want healthy hedgerows, with a separate page to actually list them off and give all the statistics. So yeah, I do have some leaflets I can send around. If I send them to you afterwards, it's a link to the web page where this leaflet is. Alternatively, later in the year, I may have them back in print, so I might be able to send some physical copies if you send me an email too.
Super, thank you. Anybody else? Do you want to pop it in the chat or kind of wave a virtual hand?
Oh, looks like, yeah.
Helen's got her hand up. Go ahead, Helen.
Yeah, a couple of things really. We do hedge laying each year in rotation on the land that we're managing. And we were sort of advised by the Blackdown hedge people to cut every 8 to 10 years, not cut, sorry, lay. And we don't actually cut the hedges, but we lay it every 8 to 10 years. So I was just interested in hearing your thoughts on that. And the second is, what time of year is best to do the survey?
Okay, so first question is the laying every 8 to 10 years and then no cutting. So that is a perfectly reasonable way of managing hedges. I'd say it's a bit more management heavy in that laying is quite an expensive thing to do. But again, it fits quite nicely into the hedgerow management cycle because it's sort of, it cuts out the hedge trimming, but you are constantly rejuvenating it, and that is the most important factor.
And the time of year for the
time of year, I'd say whenever hedges are in leaf, just because it's very difficult to do the species assessment from twigs. It's possible, but it's difficult.
Okay, thank you.
Neil's got his hand up as well. Go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, can you hear me? I've been having troubles with things. You can?
Yes.
Yep.
Good, sorry. Yeah, I just wondered, is there any sort of, I've sort of had various sort of semi-falling outs with landowners that are adjacent to me because I try and manage sympathetically, and then I'm surrounded by people who sort of play to death the hedges that border my land and on their own land and things, and kind of, you know, trying to persuade people who've been doing this for years to change anything is very, very difficult, even though I sit within an AONB and a lot of these landowners are taking grants for management, sympathetic management of their land. So I guess my question is there actually some legislation coming that's going to force some change in approach from those sorts of people?
I think there is. So obviously we're moving away from the Common Agricultural Policy, and it's provided an opportunity to rewrite our land management, the way we're paying for our land management, and so far there hasn't been everything announced yet, so we don't know. I can't tell you exactly what's going to be in there, but from what we have seen, there has been one announcement which is basically looking to pilot a project, and in that for hedges they've said not cutting all of your hedges each year is a basic requirement, which I think is a fantastic start. They've recommended incremental trimming, which is brilliant, because even if you cut your hedge every year, if you cut it slightly wider and slightly taller, not only are you reducing the structural damage done by the sort of overflailing that we often see, but also you've always got some of that sort of second year wood. So every year you cut it slightly bigger, slightly wider, you've always got some of that second year wood that flowers and fruits, which is really, really important. So the fact that that is in like the basic level that they've shown, to me is really a sign of optimism. There's a few things that I haven't seen in there yet, which I'm a little bit disappointed not to see. I don't know that there's been much about replanting gaps, whether that's coming in the basic one or whether that's a step up. To me, I think gaps and rejuvenation are the two absolute crucial things that need to be covered, because every hedge needs to be rejuvenated. So I think that should be going in at the base layer of every, you know, that's trying to attract all the farms in. But I haven't seen everything. From what I've seen, it looks promising. It's not the revolution we were expecting or hoping for, but it does look like it's going to encourage some more sympathetic management than the last one.
Thanks.
But yeah, time will tell. They've only done a few announcements so far, so we've only got a glimmer of the decisions that have been made. But we have all been feeding in as organisations to the consultations, so hopefully, you know, a lot of that will have actually made it through into the policy itself.